All right, welcome everybody to Day Tripper Tours online experiences with your host or your tour guide, Carrie Belisle. And this presentation today is just a random chronological presentation by year. I decided to do it of what happened in San Diego history and when. And you know, there's just so many different things that have happened in San Diego. If you happen to see my first or my last two presentations that were about San Diego firsts and inventions, then you've already seen quite a few. But while I was making that is when I got the idea for this too. So this puts a little bit of a year onto different things and in chronological order. So I wanted to pick a few subjects that maybe you have heard about or read about or even probably know about firsthand on some of these things. But some of those that I remember or I didn't even know had happened. So it was really fun to research. But, you know, for example, the man who possibly helped to leave an unintended trail of destruction across San Diego's topography. Or there was that thrilling ride that opened on 4th of July in 1925 that is still open today, and I have ridden on it. And then I love the little story I'm going to tell you about the unconventional family that decided to live up on top of a mountain outside the box back in the 1940s. And then I'm even going to mention about a special barbecue that was held at the La Jolla Cove for some soldiers that were stationed at Camp Kearney back in 1917. So some of these you may remember as I go through them, and some of them I think will come as a complete surprise. I do also have a guest speaker, and she's going to tell us what she found out when she was writing a book about one of the events that I'm going to be talking about. So let me get started with the three trivia questions for you, and would prefer no Googling. But at the end, we'll see if anybody got these right. So here are the chat section, or the questions, and then Seidel is going to put those in the chat section, and you can write in the chat section there and make sure that we see your answers. But here's an easy one. What newscaster got his start in San Diego on our very first TV station? Here's the second question. What famous thing took 2 days to get to its destination here in San Diego under tight security and a specially built transportation rig? And then the last question is, what movie had a World War I film scene filmed at it in La Jolla, at a popular spot in La Jolla? So those are your questions. And all right, let's get started, shall we? The first I'm going to talk about is in 1847 on January 29th. That is when the Mormon Battalion arrived in San Diego. And I'm sure you all have been to Old Town, where we have the setup there. They have the building where you can go in and learn about the long march they did. But it was back in July of 1846 that a volunteer battalion consisting of 500 men, 30 plus women, and 40 plus children, they departed Council Bluffs, which was in the territory of Iowa, and they departed for San Diego via Santa Fe, which was the capital of the territory of New Mexico. And when they arrived in Santa Fe, some of the group stayed, but then the rest continued on, and it was on January 29th in 1847 that about 339 men, 4 or 5 women, and about 6 children arrived in San Diego. And it remains to this day the longest infantry march in history, 2,000 miles. Here's a map. It's a little bit hard to see. It's pretty detailed, but they went through the desert on a trail that is now S2. If you've ever heard of that, you've probably driven on it. It goes through north of the Salton Sea, which the Salton Sea wasn't even there then. But they went through that in the San Felipe Valley, which is now all part of the Anza Borrego Desert. And each man in the battalion received $42 for a clothing allowance, and about half of that they gave to the church and helped fund the Church of Latter-day Saints. But some of the women were also paid. They were paid for doing laundry for the group. All right, here is a little bit more detail there you can see. So that's 2,000 miles going all the way from Council Bluffs to San Diego. And then here is a shot of them with some of their wagons. Now, it's interesting, by the time they got to San Diego, the war was pretty much over. We had signed the Cahuenga Treaty on January 13th of 1847, so a few months before they arrived. But they still had 6 months left of their military service. So some chose to stay in San Diego, some went back, and then some went up to Los Angeles, and they helped build the Cajon Pass. If you've ever traveled through Cajon Pass on your way to, Las Vegas, right? Anyway, and then up at Presidio Hill, which is in San Diego, just above the town, is where they stood, or where they stayed, excuse me, and that is a statue of a lone Mormon soldier there. And then I really love this picture here. This was 50-year anniversary of some of the people that did that 2,000-mile trek. So this is some of the veterans of that. All right, next I'm going to talk just briefly about the first stage line in San Diego, and that departed LA on May 18th of 1852. And they left the Franklin House, which was in what we call Old Town now, but Old Town was the town, right, until Alonzo Horton came in the late 1860s and started up the new town, which is what the Gaslamp Quarter is now. But anyway, so the stage line left the Franklin House at 5 a.m. every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. It arrived in San Juan Capistrano, which if you drive a car up there, it's about an hour and a half max to drive up there, even a little less the way some of us drive, right? But anyway, they'd arrive there at 7 p.m. So from 5 a.m. to 7 p.m., they'd stay overnight, and then they left the next morning at 5 a.m. and arrived in LA at 4 p.m., which is just amazing to think that people would do that. Population at that time, by the way, was about 800 people in Old Town and around the Mission. And here's a shot of the Mission. You know, life was quite peaceful and easy back in the day. And then this was the Franklin House right over here. If you've ever been to Old Town, it's next door to the Machado House, which is over there kind of by the schoolhouse there in their historic area. But that hotel was the first 3-story hotel, and the permanent residents that lived there were some physicians and attorneys and a judge. And anyway, so as they traveled, this is how they traveled: little 4-horse carriage that would take people up and really through the boonies back then to get up to LA. And they didn't have any other transportation until the train arrived in 1885. So this was 1852 to 1885. And you can see there's just not much out there, right? So they had to have water stops along the way, but the roads were bumpy, the people were smelly. They all complained about motion sickness because of the way the carriages would just kind of rock and roll, and really very dusty back then as well. So the quickest time ever recorded back then for a 4-horse Concord stage was 12 hours from San Diego to LA. Still a very long time, but average time was 2 days. And it even took 8 hours just to go to Escondido from Old Town. Next story is about Helen Hunt Jackson. I'm sure you all have heard of her. She wrote a pretty famous book called Ramona, and she came to San Diego in March of 1882 to just, you know, discover this area and learn about our Native Americans, because that is what she was most interested in, was talking about the plight of the Native Americans and how some of those who had been in missions, the land that was promised to them as neophytes, that they never got. So that was kind of her intention. But she decided that the only way people would really listen or read about that was to read a novel that was mixed with a little romance. And as it was, it became a very popular book. And it was a romance between Ramona, who was half Scottish, half Indian, and she was adopted by her mother's sister, who was a ranch owner. And then Alessandro, he was the full-blooded Indian, and their tragic fate. Have any of you been over to Hemet to see the Ramona pageant? It's California's longest running outdoor pageant. And it's a great show. It lasts for a few hours actually, and it's got all sorts of stuff going on. But anyway, so Ramona, the book was published in 1884 and sold 15,000 copies in 10 months. And many credit the novel with giving birth to California tourism. So here is Helen, right here, Helen Hunt Jackson. And then here is possibly the namesake of Ramona. And they do say that she was fictional, but when she came to San Diego, she also went to Temecula and she stayed with a family on a ranch. And that family, the ranch was called Rancho Wahome, and the owners was, well, the owner, I should say, was Isadora Couts, who had been married to Cave Couts, who died in 1874. So Isadora is the one who was at the ranch when Helen came, and Helen and her got in a disagreement because Helen said this ranch really should be going to the Native Americans, and so they disagreed. And so they think that the whole story kind of comes from her staying at that rancho back in 1882. So the book came out in 1884, and unfortunately, Helen died a year later. So if you have not been to see the Ramona pageant that's been taking place since 1923, then definitely see it next year. It's usually at the end of April into May. And Day Tripper Tours, we do tours up there, and we just love it. I have been there, gosh, I don't know how many times. I've seen it probably 20 times. All right, and then next is the tunnel to the Sunny Jim Cave is built, and that was in November of 1902. And it actually was just started then, and Professor Gustav Schultz from Germany, he hired a couple of men to dig the tunnel by hand, and it took them over a year to dig that tunnel. And when they reached the cave, the very first cave, it eventually got the name of Sunny Jim Cave, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute. And then Schultz started to charge money to go down to the bottom of the cave. So here is the bottom of the cave, and some well-dressed people there. Now usually people are in bathing suits and shorts. But here is, you can see the profile, right? And I'll talk about that again in just a minute. But he didn't put the steps up until 1920. So from 1900, you know, when it was actually completed, probably about 1904 to 1920, people had to hang on to a rope and lower themselves down and then just crawl on their hands and knees while they were down in the caves. And that's part of a 7-cave structure if you've ever been over there. And I have a trivia question, and I don't even know if you'll find this online or not, but what are the names of all the 7 caves? Originally, they called it the 7 Sisters, but then they name them individually, and they do not have names of sisters at all. So Sunny Jim Cave, that's your first one, but see if you know what are the names of the other 6 caves. But anyway, so how did it get the name Sunny Jim Cave? Originally, we all thought it was maybe a bootlegger because it was used as a bootlegging stash for people. They'd bring their alcohol in and then smuggle it up the staircase and then disperse it to various La Jolla businesses. But it was Frank Baum who wrote The Wizard of Oz, right? He was in San Diego. He lived over there in Coronado, and he got the inspiration. He's the one that supposedly named it Sunny Jim Cave. And oh, by the way, there's the staircase right there that goes down. Luckily, there's 145 stairs. But anyway, there was some cereal from England, and that is where he got the idea, because the little mascot man you can see there, and then here's another picture there, and see the little tuft of hair there? So it does look a little bit like it could be him with his little beard and all. And then what happened in 2016 is that a sea lion decided to go up those stairs, and it was right around closing time on January 21st of 2016, and he made it all the way up, and then the people in the shop just looked around and uh-oh, there's a sea lion in here. And they ended up, the workers there gave him some salmon and coaxed him to go back down the hell, I think they gave him some cat food, cat food salmon. All right, and then this next one is when the U.S. Grant Hotel opened, and that was October 15th in 1910. And the hotel architect was Harrison Albright. He also did Spreckels Mansion and a few other places, but it was built by Ulysses S. Grant's son and then named for his father, who was the 18th president. But the hotel originally had 437 rooms, and 350 of those had private baths. And it actually had 2 large saltwater swimming pools that were fed by water from the bay. And then the color scheme was shades of blue. That's the presidential blue shade. Now the population in San Diego when this opened was about 61,600. It replaced the Horton House. This is the Horton House right here. And that was started by Alonzo Horton back in 1870. But the new owners, which was U.S. Grant Jr., he and his wife tore it down and built the U.S. Grant. So there you go. And looks pretty nice. You can see the park across the way. And Alonzo Horton sold that to the city for $10,000 and said it must always remain a park, and it always has. But this is where the first Comic Con was back in 1970. It was placed on the Register of Historic Places in 1979. And here is a picture of it. You can see this is probably not too long after it opened. It sits on Broadway, and you can see the bay just in the background over there and some of the Navy ships. This is also where Franklin Delano Roosevelt had his first fireside chat that was not at the White House in Washington, D.C. So that was something, because they made the 11th floor not a studio, but a radio station. It was the offices and where they would announce things on the radio. Now, I was lucky enough to stay there a few years ago, and it is absolutely beautiful inside. If you've never been inside the U.S. Grant Hotel, then you should definitely go in and at least look at it, and maybe you can go to the restaurant there. And then the fountain that's across the way, this was also given by the city of San Diego to the U.S. Grant for them and for their patrons' enjoyment, because they could see it across the street. But this was the first electrically lit water fountain in the United States. And it had 15 different color effects apparently on that. And by the way, the hotel is now owned by the Kumeyaay, the Sycuan, and it's kind of come full circle, because Ulysses S. Grant is the one who gave them their land back after they had been on a reservation. And that was back in 1875. So they were happy for him. So here is a picture, the front of it. And then I was there right around Christmas time. And there it is as well at Christmas time. And then this next video is something that happened, and this was back in 1969 when a group of local female attorneys decided to stage a sit-in at the Grant Grill. And some of you might remember the Grant Grill in the 1950s and 60s was the power lunch spot downtown, and the businessmen and politicians and lawyers and bankers and newspaper editors would all have lunch there. But ladies were not permitted before 3 p.m. at all, and they were allowed after 3 p.m., but only if they were escorted by men.
What was the mood like June 17th, 1969, when your group walked in here?
Cold, very unfavorable to what we were doing.
It's part of San Diego, it's part of the Grant Grill, part of downtown. And now if we lose this, I think San Diego is going to lose something.
And I walked in and the maitre d' looked like my grandfather. I was almost crying along with him.
It was a civilized way of making a step and a stand for women.
I'm not here to protest anything, but rather to affirm my rights as a person.
Payne and the others got more than rights and the turtle soup here at the Grant Grill. Plaques honoring them now adorn the wall of the restaurant.
So there you go. That was the ladies at the U.S. Grant Hotel Grant Grill. And the Grant Grill is still there today. All right, so now I'm moving on. This is one of my favorite subjects right here. Charles Hatfield, the Rainmaker. And I think most of you have probably heard about him, but this was back December actually of 1915 is when the city hired him to make rain. And they had a verbal agreement with Charles Hatfield, the Rainmaker, to produce enough rainfall in a year to fill the Marina Reservoir. So he started that on January 1st. Now they said they would pay him $10,000 if he was successful. And if there was no rain, then he wouldn't get paid. So what did he do? He went and he set up a couple of towers. But this is Charles Hatfield, professional rainmaker, and he preferred the title Moisture Accelerator. And he was hired really because we'd already had about 3 years of drought prior to 1915. And again, 1915 was also a drought year. So this is the Marina Dam that he was told to fill up. And it's at an altitude of 3,000 feet. And if it's completely filled, it can hold 15 billion gallons of water. So he had his work cut out for him. You can see how large the reservoir is. So he set up his 2 towers, and you can see at the top of those towers is evaporative tanks. And so this is what he had, a secret slurry of chemicals that he said would extract moisture from the atmosphere and convert it to rain. So he said, I'm never going to tell you what these chemicals are, but the fumes of the chemicals by means of heat are mixed with the surrounding air, which results in an overturning of the atmosphere. That's what he said. And then that creates the cirrus clouds, and from the cirrus clouds then forms the nimbus, or the rain clouds. So there are some people that were able to find him at the Marina Reservoir. And so they kind of saw him, watched him, and they said that the chemicals, and they think there was about 23 different chemical ingredients, and they emitted fumes that they said reminded them of Limburger cheese. But anyway, so it did start to rain. So he started on January 1st, right? Doing all his magic. And January 5th, it started to rain. January 10th, it started to pour. January 14th, people's roofs were leaking and their storm drains were overflowing. And then on January 17th, the San Diego River overflowed and it flooded Old Town and Mission Valley. There's a shot of Mission Valley flooded right there. And we've seen that happen to this day, right? Maybe not so big, but we've seen it flood on certain roads getting over there by Fashion Valley. But there were roads and railroads and bridges that were swept away, water, coming down the hills. And even at one point, 4 feet of water rushed down Broadway, right in the main part of town. Now here is the Otay Lakes Reservoir, and I've got this because the rain kind of subsided for a few days, but then on January 27th, it came back with force so much that the lower Otay Dam that was built in the late 1890s, it collapsed and it flooded the Otay Valley and killed more than 20 people. Originally they thought about 50 or 60, but it was a huge wall of water up to 20 feet high that rushed down the valley, and it covered a distance of about 10 miles in 48 minutes. So on my little map here, you can see where the Otay Reservoir is, and all the way down to Palm City, which is right there kind of where the junction is when you're going into Imperial Beach from the 5. But it took 24 hours for the reservoir to empty. Most of the victims were Japanese farmers who had lived in the valleys and were doing some farming there. And even a little town called Little Landers was a total loss. But anyway, they were isolated from the world, definitely. Now, the dam was rebuilt in 1918 and renamed the Savage Dam, which was a good name for it. But it flooded everything. And really the only way to get around was that way right there. But they said there was about 19 inches of rain. So Charles Hatfield, so he was involved with all this. He thought, yes, he was responsible for all that rain. So he came to the city and he said, where's my $10,000? And they laughed at him. And they said, well, first of all, it was a verbal agreement. We never signed anything. And second of all, if we pay you $10,000, you in turn pay us the $3 million plus that it's going to take to, fix everything. And in fact, it ended up costing them about $8 million, which is about $200 million today. So it is considered by the National Weather Service as the most destructive and deadly weather event in San Diego County history. So he never got his money. It was in legal limbo for about 22 years. And then the lawsuit was eventually dismissed and the judge said it was an act of God. But now that I've talked about that, I'm going to bring on our guest speaker who has a little bit of a different look of this particular event in San Diego history. And her name is Patricia Maxwell, and she has written this book that's called When Rain Comes, which I just read it and I loved it. So Patricia, are you there?
I am.
Hey,
Thank
so
you.
great. So welcome and thank you so much for being on this little virtual presentation here, and tell us your story.
Well, as a writer, I kind of view life like a journey full of fun and heartache and wonder and drudgery. And so when I first heard this story of the Rainmaker, so when we first moved here 23 years ago, I laughed. I thought a city hired a rainmaker. That's just really hilarious. And then I started dredging into it a little bit more and found, of course, there was heartache too. And I thought, I would really like to know, how did the people react? And I can imagine they reacted like we would today, in any kind of a catastrophe. And so I created a novel based on the historical facts. And I set it in Chula Vista with a young teacher who came from Chicago, and she's going to teach here. Young orchard man by the name of Nate. He takes a real shine to her, but she doesn't want anything to do with him because she's had a bad experience in Chicago. Well, anyway, the story goes on, and when the flood happens, Nate is out trying to warn people, which is what happened. They did have communication from the Otay Dam. They had a man and his wife who lived up there, and they were communicating and said they had a few hours. They guessed maybe all day for people to get out. The dam broke sooner than that. So anyway, they did send people out to warn people in the community. So I worked that into my story. So it was really fun to build that into a story and kind of think about how the humans were dealing with first the drought, of course, and we know a lot about that. But I thought, since this is a day tripper program, might draw your attention to some things you can still see. You mentioned Marina Lake. If you go up to Marina Lake, there is a plaque there to Hatfield, and there's also a little diorama in the ranger station that shows how he did his work. What we fail to remember is that San Diego was totally cut off because all our rivers were flooded. Down here in the South Bay area, the Otay Dam completely flooded this area. Then a little farther up on the other north end of Chula Vista was the Sweetwater River. That dam did not collapse, but it overflowed. So, and then on up Mission Valley, and then even on up San Luis Rey River, and these rivers washed out the railroad tracks. So the only way you could get in and out of San Diego during that time was by boat. And that was the same way it was in Chula Vista. The other thing that was kind of caught my attention was that after the flood, the day after the flood, and the dam gave way down here in Chula Vista, some reporters went up in an airplane and took pictures. And this is the first instance of aerial photos of a news event. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But that's kind of how I got into it. And then I created this story. Some other things about it, though, I live here in Chula Vista, and it got me interested in my surroundings. Right behind our house is what they call a carriage house. It was a carriage house for a hotel that was built in the late 1800s. Around the corner from us is another house. It was built in 1905. Chula Vista has a lot of these. And if you want to take a little drive, I would recommend driving down 2nd Avenue. There are a lot of Victorian homes and interesting things to see. And drive down 3rd Avenue in Chula Vista. There are some old businesses there that have been there for a long time.
Now, can you tell us about Little Landers? Because that seemed like such a neat little town.
Yes, that was fascinating. It was called Little Landers. It was kind of a commune, I guess, a bit. And they advertised it as if you only had a little land, like I think it was a 1/4 acre. And that's how they sold it. A little bit of land, you could sustain yourself. Of course, you'd need a little bit more if you were family. So it's called Little Landers. And these weren't just farmers from the Midwest. These were educated people like lawyers and doctors and so forth and so on, teachers who kind of wanted to try this agrarian way of life. Well, that community was totally washed away. And I mentioned it in my book that I'm writing now about the Little Landers. But that was kind of an interesting little thing I found. Some other interesting things you can see here in Chula Vista. And the fascinating thing was I went down on F Street and 5th, and there's a Victorian house there that's painted blue. And I thought, that is the house I'm going to place my character Carrie in. She's a teacher and she boarded with somebody in that house.
I knew there was a reason I liked that book, because it had my name in there.
Yeah, okay. Because it was just a few blocks from the school, which was brand new. It was a brand new school in opened in fall of 1915. And that is located where the current library is. Another thing interesting to see on the corner of G and 5th is the very first kindergarten building. It looks like it's created into a house now. That used to be behind the school, but that's an interesting little building. Right next to it, 511 G Street, is the insectary. This is where they tried to grow insects that would be beneficial, because this is agriculture. This is the lemon capital. And that is still there. It's a Department of Agriculture building. So we've got fun things here in Chula Vista to see that I think are really pretty exciting. But if you'd like to read about it, do get my book. You can find it on Amazon. Just go to Amazon.com and type in When Rain Comes, my name, Patricia Maxwell. And I want to go a little bit further and mention the story seemed to need a sequel. And so immediately after I got this one out, and it came out in late 2015, in time for the 100-year anniversary celebration of the flood and everything down here in Chula Vista. So a few months after that, I thought I need to write a little bit more, so I wrote a sequel. Then my husband was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and my life kind of fell apart, especially I lose my creativity. He eventually passed away, and I just couldn't seem to, anyway, that project got on hold. I'm now resurrecting it. In fact, I believe that God used this COVID-19 epidemic to get me back on track with writing. Because I started putting little blogs up on Facebook about my feelings toward the coronavirus, all of the stuff, and a lot of it I see is funny, some of it not so funny. I do the whole gamut. Again, that comes back to my main principle as a writer, that life is full of joys, sorrows, all the rest, and I'm just a person that goes along and looks at those things and invites people to come along with me. So if you'd like to come along with me, I've just started a new Facebook page called Patricia G. Maxwell Writes. That's WRITES. Just a brand new page, but I'll be putting up little things there, and I will be continuing to work on this sequel. And maybe there'll be another book. I don't know.
Okay. That sounds great. And that was your first novel, right? That
was
you
my
had
first
written.
novel. I've been a nonfiction writer for many, many years and written inspirational articles, technical articles, but this was my first novel.
Well, great. I think you'll find that some people are probably going to get this book. I read it, and it's easy reading. It's nice reading. It's just a nice story about Nate and Carrie and her resistance to his charm initially, but the flood brought them together, and I'm looking forward to the sequel. Well, thank you very much, Pat. I so appreciate you spending some time today with us and telling us about your book, When Rain Comes. And if you want to stay on for the rest of this, you're more than welcome to, but I am going to continue on now. So thanks again, Pat. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay, we'll see you later.
Okay.
And then just one more thing about The Rainmaker. They actually made a movie with Burt Lancaster and Katharine Hepburn, and that was back in 1958. And then he died just a couple of years later, and you can see he's standing there and with some of the cast there of that movie. And he never did reveal what his secret formula was. And it's kind of interesting, his brother, who had helped him with everything, died in 1974, and he never told either. But when Charles Hatfield died in Pear Blossom, California in 1958 at the age of 82, his brother didn't report it for 3 months because he was a little afraid that people are still mad at the man for causing all of that havoc on the land. All right, so now we'll move on to that special barbecue that they had for the World War I troops in La Jolla, and it was for the soldiers from Camp Kearney Army Base, and this was back in June of 1917 on the 22nd. And anyway, they like to visit La Jolla, so the residents there would plan things for them, and they thought, well, let's plan this great barbecue for them. And it was such a big event that they included the governor of Baja California, as well as a 45-piece band, if you can believe that. Now, the population back then was about 100,000 people, but the barbecue they had was a whale barbecue. And so here is La Jolla Cove way back in the day, very quiet. And then I've got this picture here. Now, this is not of San Diego, but this is up the coast at Moss Landing, which is over there by Monterey, California. And whaling was a pretty big business until the 1860s, really. And so this would be a typical thing where they'd get a whale into this place and they'd cut it up and use it for blubber and such. I don't actually know how popular whale barbecues were, but to have that in 1917 was a pretty unique thing that they had. Here are some of the soldiers there. And here is the beach. Now, to me, this looks like a La Jolla beach, right? They've got the benches set up, and I imagine that the music was just off in the corner playing, you know, and then the whale. So here is some whale meat, actually, right here. Now, some people think, oh, it must have kind of a fishy taste, but they say, and I was reading online about what people think that whale tastes like, because I've never had it, but it's a mammal, right? So it doesn't taste fishy. It tastes more like beef. And in fact, they said it's kind of gamey. It tastes more like a moose or reindeer, and very chewy and tough. So there you go. Has anybody ever had whale? If you have, put that in the chat section, would you? I'd be curious. Okay, in 1925, March 1st is when we had the first scheduled airline in the United States, and the first regularly scheduled, and that was between San Diego and LA. They'd start in LA to bring people to San Diego, and then they'd bring them back. And it was Claude Ryan who started that, and he had done some sightseeing excursions and charters, and so he and his partner bought 3 World War I J-1 biplanes from Texas. They had the plane shipped over, they put some new engines in there, and they revamped it to hold 4 people in the front with a balance in the back, kind of balancing, with a pilot in the back, excuse me, kind of balancing everything. It's $22.50 round trip if you wanted to go there. Now, population in San Diego then was about 150,000 people. But here is Dutch Flats, and this is where they put the Ryan Flying Company, excuse me. And then here is their terminal right there. And then here is a little bit more of a close-up. In fact, that looks like a flooded terminal right there. And then here is one of the planes. Now, they did get a bigger plane that held 10 people, but initially they had these smaller planes that held just 4 people, and they only had 3 of them. So their first 12 passengers were celebrities from Hollywood, right? So they started up in Hollywood. They took off at 10 a.m. They flew at a level of about 1,500 feet and arrived in San Diego at Dutch Flats in 90 minutes. So here's a great picture of them flying in the sky. I just love that. And in fact, the Army and Navy sent 3 planes to escort those first flights. So you'd think that was pretty popular, right? But people weren't really into it. And within 2 years, it was canceled. They closed operations just to concentrate more on building planes. And so what did they build? The Spirit of St. Louis, right? And Charles Lindbergh right there. So that was helped put them on the map twice, all those things. Okay, now here is that one thing that opened up that was so thrilling that still is here today, and that's the Giant Dipper over at what we call Belmont Park, but it had a different name back then. But that was July 4th, 1925. And have you all ridden that before? It's a wooden roller coaster, and it's pretty bumpy. It lasts just shy of 1 minute long. You go over 13 hills, and it goes 43 miles per hour. And the original cost was $150,000, and it was built in 2 months, which is a little scary actually, but 2 months to build that, but it still stands today. And it was John Spreckles who got the idea for that because he owned a lot of land that he was trying to sell over in Mission Beach. This is a picture of Mission Beach and Mission Bay before they had the little bridges that came over, you know, like where the Bahia Hotel is now. So anyway, that was it before. So instead they'd come up by trolley, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. But anyway, his place was called the Mission Beach Entertainment Center, and it had the Giant Dipper, and here's kind of an overall view there. And then the big buildings there, one of those houses a big pool, and in fact that pool was called a natatorium, and it was the largest saltwater pool in the world. It was 60 feet by 170 feet, and it would get salt water directly from the ocean there. It hold 400,000 gallons. But eventually in 1940, it was starting to rot away, so they replaced it with fresh water and changed the name to the Plunge. But this is people just standing in line to ride on that roller coaster, and it's thrilling. I mean, it's a fun thing to do. I don't know if I like them so much now as I did when I was a kid. But this is how they would arrive. They could come by car or by that trolley. And the trolleys ran until about 1927. So, and this opened in 1925. But it's unfortunate that we no longer have that trolley system there. But anyway, so it is it has been put on the National Register of Historic Places, and we're hoping that it will stay. At one point, it almost was torn down. And here's some people just out there relaxing out there by the beach in front of the whole complex. And then this is what it looks like today. So the next I'm going to talk about when the children's pool opened, and I'm sure you all have seen that, and that was May 31st, 1931. Ellen Browning Scripps got the idea for a breakwater wall after a child drowned in that area back in 1920. So it took a while to get it built. They had to bring all the concrete from Riverside, and then as you can see, it was over 3,000 barrels of concrete and then 31 tons of rail. So that all came by the train, and then they had to transport it over by vehicle, and it was tough. Plus it was the bedrock, you know, just building through that was really hard, and then just the constant waves coming through it made for difficult building. But they needed extensive planning, and anyway, the wall it extends, you know, kind of goes in a semicircle, and it gets gradually taller from 10 feet to 16 feet. And that's really so it doesn't mar the beauty of the whole coastline there. But it was meant for children, right? But you know, as I know, that in the 1990s is when the harbor seals kind of came in and took over. So they're still there to this day, and they cannot be well, people can't come down there during pupping season, and then the rest of the year they really try to monitor people so they don't go and bother them. But anyway, it's there is the wall right there. Now, one of my trivia questions that I had at the beginning was what movie was filmed in a location of La Jolla that's fairly well known, and it was right here at this little children's pool area. So by the way, the waves can kind of sneak up on you. And I wanted to say William Templeton Johnson was the one who was the architect, and I'm going to mention him just a little bit later as well. But Ellen Browning Scripps is really the one who financed everything, and she financed a lot in La Jolla. Okay, so let's get to that movie. Oh wait, first of all, I have the slide. This is an overall. You can see right over here is the yeah, see there, that's the wall, and so that whole area is protected. But anyway, the movie that they filmed there was called The Stunt Man, and they also filmed it over at the Hotel Del Coronado, but it was a World War I beach battle scene. Peter O'Toole was in it, and they say in the movie that he was transported by a crane from the children's pool to the veranda of the Del, like it was just right next to it. But as we know, it wasn't. But anyway, that was them filming that scene over there. Okay, next is when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as president, came down to dedicate the San Diego Civic Center, which we all now know as the San Diego County Administration Building. But William Templeton Johnson was an architect of that, along with Richard Requa and Louis John Gill, who was the son of the other famous Irving Gill. But anyway, so he came down on July 16th of 1938, and he was in a 7-passenger car that was owned by Cecil B. DeMille. He came from Long Beach. He came to dedicate the center. He never got out of the car. I guess he did that a lot because of his polio. He didn't always get out of the car. He said his speech right there, and before and after he came to San Diego quite a bit because his son was stationed over at Coronado. But anyway, so he is the one that dedicated our center there, the Civic Center, and you can see it way off in the distance. Back in the early days, it really stood out. And there's another picture of it, a little bit more modern. All right, and then we have the story about Marshall South and his family's experiment in primitive living. So it was in 1940 when people first started to read about him. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the Marshall South story. I've talked about him when I take people to the Anza Borrego Desert, because that's where his ghost mountain was. And from 1930 to 1947 is when he and his wife Tanya and their 3 kids lived there. In fact, all 3 kids were born on the mountain, but technically she would go to Oceanside to have her babies and then come back. But it was a pretty tough living. And so he wrote about it for 8 years for the Desert Magazine, and it was a monthly article. And in fact, when we send you a little bit later, we send you a survey, and then after that we'll send you another email, and I'm going to include the very first article that people read about this man and his wife and their kids living up there at Ghost Mountain. But they called it Yaquitepec, and that was a Native American word for the Yaqui Native Americans. But they ended up getting divorced in 1947, so Tanya left with the kids, and then he died just a year later. But some of the kids changed their name originally so they wouldn't be known as that Marshall South family. So here is the family. You can see them there. And that was just a year before he died. And it was right about when they were getting their divorce. But that's their view from Ghost Mountain there. And then I'm going to play a video that hopefully will start there. And while the video is playing, I'm going to just talk a little bit about them. So Marshall was originally from Australia, and anyway, he and Tanya met, and he said, I want to go live up in the middle of nowhere. And she said, okay. So their 3 kids were Ryder and Richard and Victoria. But it was in March of 1940 that he received a one-year contract to write a series of 12 articles after an article that he had wrote for the Saturday Evening Post. And he called it The Desert Diary. And it went on for not only 12 articles, it went on again for about 8 years. But he just wrote about the desert and his passion for that kind of life. And the children, they were raised primitively, but actually, believe it or not, they got a lot of gifts. They were kind of adopted by all the people that read those articles. And so they had so many people visiting them, in fact, that they had to put up a no clothes rule to control the number of people visiting them. But they had about 50 guests a year that would do the long trail up. It was about a 1 mile steep trail just to get up, as you can see there, to where they lived. But eventually they had a nice kind of adobe type home. But at Christmas time, one time, they got so many presents that it took them over a week to open all of their Christmas presents for the kids. So they were not lacking there. But you can see right there their home and their life. It's really an interesting story. And if you just look online, in fact, the oldest son, Ryder, actually, after Tanya died, and she was almost 100 years old when she died in 1997, but after she died, then that's when the oldest son, Ryder, came and spoke. He was in a couple of interviews. And so there is one online, if you look it up, of his interview and just talking about life up there. But, at the time, that's all they knew, right? They were homeschooled, and that is the only life they knew. And then I'm moving on here. I'm moving on to November 18th, 1947, and that is when the telescope lens for the Hale telescope made its way up to Mount Palomar. And have you guys ever been up to Mount Palomar? It is a windy road, and I have driven it myself, actually, in a bus, in a stick shift bus, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But anyway, so the disc had already made it from New York by train over to Pasadena, where it was grounded down and made into exactly the size and shape they wanted it to get it up to Mount Palomar. So it had started like 10 years prior, but it was finally in 1947, the weatherman said, okay, you're going to have 2 good days of weather, so go now. But it took them 2 days just to get out of the actual building over there at Caltech, because it was, the rig was 79 feet long. It had 42 wheels, and it was 20 feet wide. And what they were trying to exit out of was 24 feet wide. So they had 2 feet on either side, and then they had to do a 90-degree turn. That's why it took them 2 days just to get out of the shop. But then they left on Tuesday, November 18th at 3:15 in the morning, and they were escorted by police, the California Highway Patrol, some armed guards. The exact date was kept a secret because they were worried that, I don't know, people would ambush them or something like that. But it was a specially designed semi-trailer that was used, and there was a company called the Bellier Truck Company that accepted the job of moving it. And this was something, the Hale telescope, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing of the making the telescope, but I mean that in and of itself is a great story, just the pouring of it and the having to wait for 6 months to see if it had cracked. But anyway, so I digress. They were the ones that moved it up. So eventually they got to Escondido, which was 126 miles away, and then from there they had to continue on over to Mount Palomar to a specially made road, which was called Highway to the Stars. And that's the road at the south entrance, and that's the windy one. But it was made knowing that they were going to be bringing this big lens all the way up. But it took them a long time. They went, foot by foot. They got 3 miles to the gallon. And on average, when they left Pasadena, they were averaging about 11 miles an hour, which isn't too bad. But that last part, going up that 13-mile climb up to Mount Palomar on the Highway to the Stars, that was tough. And because of the weight, it weighed 60 tons. They had 2 tractors that were behind the big rig. And so they helped push it, but it was so foggy. The weather was not great, like the weatherman had said. So it was so foggy, and then it sleet, and then it snowed that they couldn't even see the front, you know, they couldn't see the telescope itself being transported. And so they had to listen. They had to listen for the engine. And if you're really good on the stick shift, you know when it's about time to change gears. So they would just listen enough. And then they all three would kind of change gears at the same time. And then as you can see, there was somebody that would stand on it and they would tell them, you know, what was coming up. And there were people walking alongside of it. But here you can see the road was pretty tiny. So when I drove a bus up there, and it was a stick shift bus, you know, it's a windy road. And I said to the guy when I got to the top, that's kind of a tough road. And he goes, yeah, well, you should have seen the people bring the lens up. They had a real hard time. So anyway, and then this is the lens right here. And then this is the actual telescope. And they do open it to public. The group I took up was from the Reuben H. Fleet Space Theater and Science Center. So that was that. And then we have the first TV broadcast in San Diego, and that was May 16th of 1949, and it was KFMB TV. And they had the big gala over there at the Hotel San Diego, and they said that an estimated 50,000 people saw that first show. And their opening program was emceed by Al Jarvis, and they had the Ernie Feliz Quartet, Martha Tilton, Clark Dennis, Sons of the Pioneers, and Johnny Moore, Three Blazers. And I looked up all of those online, and they were well-known people back in the day. But they put up the antennas over there at Mount Soledad, so they are still there to this day. And then this is their logo back at the time, the KFMB TV. And that was, you know, from 1949, and then they've changed it over the years. Some of their first shows that they had would have been Monty Hall's Tiny Town Ranch. Anybody remember that? Or Smokey Rogers' Music Telethon. Harold Keene was one of the newscasters, as was Ray Wilson, and he also did interviews. A couple of their popular shows was Zoo-Rama. Do you guys remember that? That was about the San Diego Zoo. They won a couple of awards for that. And then they had Operation Thanks, which honored service members around the world with filmed greetings taken from San Diego. And they'd send them over to the GIs that were overseas. But anyway, so here is a picture of the Hotel San Diego, which is where they had their gala opening, and they also had their station there until 1953. Now it's over in Kearny Mesa off of Engineer Road. And then one of the questions I asked was, who got their start there way back when? And that would be Regis Philbin. And you can see his picture there. And then do you see the lady on the left? You know who that is? She started as a weather girl there in the early 1960s, and that's Raquel Welch. Raquel Tejada was her original name, and then changed it. But she has an interesting past too. I was looking up about her. But anyway, Regis Philbin, unfortunately, he just passed away just a few days ago. But some people called him Reg or outrageous. And he is in the Guinness World Record for the most time in front of a TV camera, 16,700 hours. That is a lot. So we're going to miss Regis Philbin. And then we have in August 2nd, 1969 is when the San Diego Coronado Bay Bridge opened. And I'm sure you all have been across that bridge, and it was Governor Ronald Reagan that did the dedication. And it was funny because he was supposed to be the first one across the bridge, but the day before there was a lady who had a baby and had to be rushed across the bridge. So he was not the first one. But anyway, it sits anywhere from 220 to 250 feet high. If you ask any tour guide, we'll all give you a different answer, but it has to be tall enough for the Navy ships to pass under it. That is a Navy requirement, same as the Golden Gate Bridge over there in San Francisco. And then the side panels are just 34 inches, so you get a great view, especially when you go over in a bus. But here it is being built there, and then a little bit of completion. It would cost $47.5 million to build it. And then there you are. And I love this picture. That must have been when they were just putting in that very last section. And then here's a picture I took from the plane. So it connects Coronado and San Diego. And then here's the last thing I'm going to talk about. I'm just a couple of minutes behind, but the Reuben H. Fleet Space Theater and Science Center opened to the public on March 10th, 1973. And I'm sure somewhere there are people that have gone to that very first opening. That would have been something. We were the very first ones to have an OmniMax theater, and you've seen the IMAX theaters, right? But OmniMax, this was special because it was at an angle, a 25-degree angle, and it was a 76-foot dome. So they used it as a planetarium and as a movie theater. And it was like you were suspended in space. So that's a picture of it from the front, and then some of the seats there. It was proposed way back in 1957, and it was actually in 1965, 2 employees of General Dynamics were the ones to develop and unveil a model planetarium with that new concept of having a digital computer-controlled space transit simulator. And that is what that is right there. So you have probably all been in there when it's been a planetarium and they're showing you all of the stars. So it really creates a sensation of you're traveling through space, and it really accurately recreates the star field to this day. And they can go back and tell you what the stars were like, 50 years ago. It's just amazing. But anyway, the OmniMax, that was something that was coined by the Space Theater founders for our special giant tilted dome screen. So we have movies specifically for the OmniMax, and then we also have the IMAX movies that we can show at our OmniMax theater. And it's named, the Reuben H. Fleet is named for Major Reuben H. Fleet, who founded the U.S. Airmail Service. Believe it or not, he was Airmail Pilot #1. And he also had his San Diego-based company called the Consolidated Aircraft. They were the ones that built the B-24 Liberators and the Catalina. And then here is what was showing on that very first day. You got a double bill there. You got to see Voyage to the Outer Planets, which was a combined planetarium show and OmniMax film. And then you got the OmniMax film called Garden Isle. So the very first ever to show, and that was back in 1973. Now, by the way, they have a Residence Day, as you all know. If you go to the first Tuesday of each month, you can get in free to the Science Center, but you still have to pay for the movie. So there you go, everybody. That was just some of what's happened in San Diego history, and I want to thank you so much for joining Day Tripper Tours and me for our online experience about what happened in San Diego and when.